in science and in healthcare with a little bit more than 10 years, covering sectors from pharma and medical device. And I have been in medical affairs, as well as regulatory policy, and now in market access. So I'm really passionate about bringing innovation into the market, and especially to get this innovation to reach patients. So going from the science that really demonstrate the value of these innovations to really finding mechanisms and funding approaches to enable this access of these innovations to patients is really a passion of mine. And thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thanks, Anne. I will switch over to Anand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Frederick, and good morning, everybody. First of all, thanks for inviting me for this interesting session today. Myself, as Frederick was telling, I'm the MD of a small consulting firm called Ansea, which was born 3 years ago. We work with the medical device and pharma companies in the area of access, pricing, policy shaping, and commercial planning. My background in terms of pricing and market access, most of my, I would say around 20 years of experience has been in pricing, access, and commercial operations. In my very last role in corporate, I was the regional head of market access, pricing, government affairs and reimbursement for Alcon, a division of Novartis. Before that, I spent around 15 years with the Novartis group in global pricing and access functions in Basel, where I was there looking after pricing and reimbursement, and especially for the emerging markets, emerging growth markets. And also, working on the brand value dossiers and other things. And then have been in Singapore for almost 10 years. Here, I kind of set up the market access function for Novartis Oncology, and working with the government's patient access programs and different innovative schemes that I was kind of leading. So very happy to be over here. I've been working with some of the, I think a couple of you I've interacted with before as well from the cohort, and very passionate in helping companies like yours to bring your innovative products for the patients, for the markets. So happy to be contributing my experience.
Great, thank you, Anand. And Fabio, please.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Fabio Mola. I'm a partner in LEK. Thanks, Frederick, for the invitation for this. And we're a large consulting firm. We work with a number of different sectors, but healthcare is about 40% of our overall global projects. And within that, we tend to do strategy for relatively larger companies, mid-size and large companies, but occasionally we also work with startups to help them define the strategy for their products. And that means from the markets that they should go after to the type of pricing and reimbursement they should think about. Market access and reimbursement clearly is an issue in a area of discussion for our larger clients, and we do a fair amount of work on that front. But most of those principles are then applicable to a startup. And most times it's the same route that you have to go, whether you're an established company or a startup. And most times the difficulties with obtaining new reimbursement codes or thinking about pricing in the private market tend to be a very similar set of issues, regardless of company size. And so happy to share some experiences, again, more from the larger company side, but that would be, I think, largely applicable to startups as well.
Great, thanks, Fabio. And maybe I'll start with you. If you can just give us your thoughts at a very high level in terms of what you see as the biggest trends across Asia Pacific in the area of reimbursement.
So I think let's start maybe one step back. Reimbursement is a function of primarily government priorities and government budgets. And the problem across Asia Pacific is that depending on which government you're referring to, there is very different abilities to pay. So if you look at a Japan, if you look at Australia, if you look at a Taiwan, Korea, you get places that have a certain willingness to pay, and there are typically governments that you can discuss with around, what that specific device will do to improve healthcare costs or to improve patient lives, et cetera, And so the reimbursement discussions are not necessarily easier, but there is a more fertile ground for those type of reimbursement discussions. Whereas if you look at markets like Vietnam, like Indonesia, where theoretically there is a universal coverage, the reality is that they have a lot of competing priorities. They're still looking at, how do we pay for a large diabetic population or a large CV, a cardiovascular population that is requesting healthcare coverage, and most times the healthcare coverage is relatively small. So sometimes innovation has no other route than going private first, and as it gets a better hold, then it becomes a reimbursed product. So I would say the first point is really around the type of healthcare system that you're facing and the type of budgets that these healthcare systems have. And yes, there is a trend towards universal healthcare, but I wouldn't take that as automatically as a trend towards universal reimbursement. It's not the same thing. The second point that I would make is a lot of Asian countries, again, varies a lot in the lot that we just discussed, but a lot of Asian countries will look at budget impact first before they think about patient lives. The reality is, again, that the pot of money that exists is relatively limited. And so even though you may come out with a fancy HTA analysis, only someone like Japan would be able to really, or Australia to a certain extent, would be able to evaluate that properly. Singapore is probably another one. But you really get very, very few countries. Others, it's straight, how much money, how much discount can you give me in order to get reimbursed? The other thing that I would say is people are grappling with a lot of tangential issues around medtech. So companion diagnostics is one of them. How do we think about reimbursing a companion diagnostics? It's a straight cost for the healthcare system, but it's if you look overall, the therapy cost is actually quite cost effective to reimburse sector companion diagnostics so you can get the right drug in the first place. And so that's a different conversation than, say, for example, a new stenting system or a new surgical system, right? Because you actually have to bring into bear the conversation around what the therapy cost is. And again, most systems are not equipped for that because the incentives sit in different parts of the system when it comes to food therapy. And last trend, I would say, there is a serious look that a lot of healthcare regulators are taking towards digital health. Although no one is yet prepared to, or very few are yet prepared to reimburse. We've seen some in Germany. We do think that the regulatory path for approval needs to be fixed first before we even think about reimbursement. And right now, the regulatory approval path isn't terribly clear in most countries. Europe, yes, US, yes, but in Asia Pacific, again, the Taiwanese authorities are thinking about it. Singapore is thinking about it, but there hasn't been, enough clear guidance at this point. But I would say those are the three big things that I would watch out for. Again, increasing universal reimbursement, sort of more tangential, sort of combination of medtech plus pharma, and then the digital side.
Thanks for that, Fabio. And we will, of course, dive into many of these topics in a lot more detail during the course of this discussion. We'll talk about universal health coverage, we'll talk about HTAs, and we'll talk about the digital health aspect here as well. Quick question here for Anand. When you work with smaller companies, are they typically aware of these challenges, and when should really a medical technology startup begin thinking about some of the reimbursement challenges that Fabio just highlighted?
Thanks, Frederick. So typically what I've seen is that, and rightly so, most of the startups are looking at what is the right commercial model. That's the first thing that you should have before looking at, and then pricing part of PNR comes into it. What should be the right pricing that you should have. But reimbursement, I haven't seen the discussions happening about the reimbursement models, what could be there. And I would argue also that it would be very early before before the startup companies have fixed their commercial strategy and the pricing comes into that. What kind of segmentation, who are your target customers and how you go about it. So that's something is much more important than looking at the reimbursement phase. It's important to understand, because when you're looking at expanding and scaling up, and when you're talking to your investors, you should have a good understanding. You should at least talk the language of what this pricing and reimbursement landscape is looking like. Because even if you can survive with the self-pay, there would be a point where you need to work with, but there is a private insurance, but also you have to work with some of the governments to make sure that you are really going to the next level. So in that sense, I haven't seen a lot of discussions on reimbursement. And I think at an early stage, beyond understanding these dynamics, I think it would be, it's a bit early. But maybe one thing I wanted to add on to what Fabio was saying in terms of the trends, it's extremely important to understand the priorities of the government in terms of whether they consider healthcare as an expense or as an investment. There are governments, or also the different governments in the same country, when they come in, the finance or the investment industry minister is telling you to invest, whereas you're sometimes from the Ministry of Health side, because of the budget constraints, you are talking about price being cut. So you have to understand that piece. But also for the device companies, what you have to understand that the payment many of the times is based on the DRGs. So you are given, the hospitals are given one particular amount. So when you're coming with some innovation, unless you are able to establish, Korea, for example, comes as something where I was involved in a discussion where you only get X amount of money. So whatever additional value you are giving through your device for the patient or for the clinician surgeon, there is lesser incentive for them to invest into the higher end technology because the amount is only as much. So one has to understand how the funding flows and the decision making work in the system and how your new innovation fits in. So that is something I would say is extremely important. Reimbursement is a bit early. Understand the pricing and the positioning that you have. That would be my advice for the companies.
Very good, very good. And Anand, from just very quickly from a multinational perspective, what are some of the major reimbursement challenges and the things topics related to reimbursement that keep you up at night, and other priorities for a large multinational like Johnson & Johnson?
So yes, I think that many right now actually keeping me awake for reimbursement challenges. And one of the first thing I say, really picking back on what Anand said, is really what is the value of your innovation that is going to provide to the country or the group level population that you're targeting, and therefore what is the proof that you're going to provide to the payer to justify reimbursement. And what we have observed is that obviously the budget is in healthcare is being reduced, and the justification has become harder and harder. Whether you're talking about established countries such as Australia or Korea or Japan, they have really clear and established reimbursement pathways. You're talking about what Fabio was saying on more of the developing countries like Vietnam, Southeast Asia, where that evaluation and funding reimbursement is more nascent. What we observe is really in the established reimbursed markets, the requirements for reimbursement has gone extremely stringent. So we really have to demonstrate with clear evidence and supporting studies on the value of our innovation. It is less enough to just provide the features and benefits. We really have to have clear and strong evidence supporting it, and more also demonstrate what is the economic impact of the innovation that would be bringing. And then if you really look at the more of developing countries, you see also that trends towards looking at what the other countries are recommending in terms of reimbursement, and then how does that apply to these specific countries with less willingness to pay and less affordability.
Those are great comments, thanks for that. And then moving right along here into maybe a deeper discussion about reimbursement. And for those in our audience who are relatively new to this, of course, in Asia Pacific being so diverse, we have reimbursed markets, we have out-of-pocket markets, we have co-pay markets. The reimbursed markets being the likes of Japan, Australia, Taiwan, Korea, and so on. And many of the developing countries being completely out of pocket. And maybe I'll turn to Fabio on this one. So from the point of view of a medical technology startup, what should be the market launch priorities of a startup? Would you recommend that they focus on the out-of-pocket markets first, because you don't need reimbursement, obviously, to launching a product there? Or does it make sense to begin that reimbursement application process for some of the more established markets?
So I guess I would say that it depends on where the commercial focus is. If the commercial focus is US, EU, right? So we've done a piece of work more recently for a startup here in Singapore, which wanted to really understand US and EU markets, because that's where they saw the greatest opportunity. Typically, those are reimbursed markets, and so you need to plan for your reimbursement early. And the systems are very, very different, as we may go into a little bit more detail later. But there is a similar. So if your commercial focus is Asia Pacific, again, I would say it depends on what kind of product they have and what kind of market you're going after. Clearly, going after reimbursed markets creates significant revenues early. And so that clearly increases valuations and clearly increases the desire of a medtech startup, especially if it has external capital to go for reimbursed markets. So I think actually it has less to do with the product itself and more actually with the composition of the startup and the startup capital. So one of the things I would say is reimbursement on average is always better than out of pocket, because out of pocket is you're basically selling one customer at a time. Reimbursement is clearly you are removing one of the barriers to use. And I would say that the reimbursed markets is always better if there's an existing code that specific device can already use. As Anand was hinting at, as Han was hinting at, there is already established procedures. There are already established medical device codes that new products may be able to use. And that becomes less painful from a reimbursement perspective. So you can actually enter into, you can actually use the same DRG that an established device uses, for example, and be assigned the same reimbursement code. So if that route is available to you, that's a good one to use. I would then say, if that route is not available to you, then maybe one of the strategies is to launch in the private market, get acceptance from clinicians, and then go for reimbursement. But I would probably not launch strictly in out-of-pocket markets as the first option, because I do think that the scalability of revenues is extremely hard. If your product is good enough, you should definitely launch in our reimbursed markets, and whether you go straight for reimbursement or you go for a private pay route first versus a reimbursement route, that's a choice that depends largely on the specific device you have, and whether you can get whether you need to get a new reimbursement code or you can use an existing reimbursement code.
Those are great insights. Thanks for that, Fabio. And Anand, maybe you want to comment on that briefly as well, and perhaps talk a bit about if there are fundamental differences in the reimbursement application process across Asia Pacific, and how some of the market fundamentally differ in that aspect.
Yes, I would say building on, but also slightly different view in terms of, for me, every market is out-of-pocket market when you start, right? And it's very generic to say reimbursed markets or out-of-pocket markets. In many of the markets which are so-called reimbursed markets, many of the times the companies say, I don't want to go into this reimbursement pocket. It's better to have self-pay, because the moment you come into the reimbursed segment, you have to justify the price. Whereas the value is such that the patients are willing to self-pay. And in some of the countries, if you are having a part of this reimbursement group, then you are automatically in a way controlled by the government, because they are looking at multiple other priorities. Whereas the patient, for this new technology, if there is an implant or if there is something that the person is using once for multiple years, then the price flexibility is I would say price is less elastic. You can get the benefits. So I would say, before bothering about reimbursed market or non-reimbursed market, typically your technology is something that you would like to have a reasonable return for innovation. So look at where your target patients or target customers would be, independent of the market. You look at the affordability, you look at where you have the biggest commercial opportunity. And then typically, when I say the reimbursed markets, the richer ones, more affordable, they may win, because sometimes you'll have more affordability there, except in some of the reimbursed countries where the patients are used to have governments pay for everything. They say, look, although I can afford it, but I'm used to it being covered. So in that sense, I would say, before saying this is a reimbursed market, this non-reimbursed market, understand how the funding, how the payment works, who pays for your technology, before saying I would go into reimbursement because the scalability is more over there. Also, I was in discussions before in the UK as well, where some of the companies said, for the latest technology, I would not go into reimbursement because I would have rather self-pay. So that's what I would say. In terms of the reimbursement application for the devices, I think the systems are still bit, I would say, still maturing in terms of how to do the assessment for a device or a technology. So in many of the countries, you can proactively submit, or sometimes you're invited for having your submission. You may need to provide your health economic justification in markets such as, for example, Korea or Australia. Taiwan doesn't look at health economic justification. In Singapore now with ACE, they do have ways in which your technology would be assessed. So, and each of them are very transparent in terms of what are the procedures, what is it that is expected. The challenge comes more in the discussions, how the interpretation and how the discussions and how they are seeking value that will happen. So again, as I said, at this stage, look at the commercial model, go for the markets where you think you have the best possibility. Still look at how you would be looking at scaling up, and there you need to understand how to get into the reimbursement segment of the market, and then go further from there.
Good feedback, Anand. Thanks for that. Anand, anything you want to perhaps add to that in terms of perhaps how J&J is approaching the launch of new innovations in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the first thing I would like to highlight is really the value of your innovation and whether it is addressing an unmet need in the market. Because if your innovation is going to really provide a significant benefit to an unmet need in that market, then you will be able to find a stakeholder who would be willing to pay for it, whether it's a national insurance payer or it is the patient out of pocket. And actually, in some markets, it's very interesting, and I like that caution around don't necessarily think countries as clear-cut reimbursed or out-of-pocket markets, because Taiwan, for example, is considered as a fully reimbursed, full coverage, very good healthcare system, but they actually do have a part in the reimbursement and reimbursement pricing that is what they call balanced billing, that has or even self-pay category that is really entirely paid by the patient. And it is actually a very interesting category for manufacturers to consider, because the price and then are freely fixed by the manufacturer and with the provider hospitals. But when you are in the reimbursement category, then your pricing would be significantly cut. So I think it's really from the manufacturer's perspective on what is your best strategy. Do you want to go into that higher pricing, but then maybe a little bit more limited because the patient would have to pay for it, and you have to find these patients willing to pay, compared to the reimbursement where the price would be lower, but then you'd have the volume.
Good point, and that's perhaps a good segue to talk about sub-country specifics. You mentioned Taiwan as an example, and I guess a similar one perhaps might be Australia, where you have the prosthesis list. You're on the list or you're not, and maybe you can tell us a little about. And I know you're working a lot in orthopedics, so you would probably know this well. What is the prosthesis list, and how does that situation look in Australia?
The prosthesis list for devices, and especially in orthopedics, is the holy grail. So it is a list of devices and prosthesis devices that has been approved, and if you go on that list, it means that your device would be covered by the private insurance in the private sector, and that reimbursement would be on top of the normal procedure fee. So it is a really the standard pathway if you want to really go in the private sector in Australia. In order to go in that prosthesis list, the criteria and process that is very clear and straightforward. You have to meet a certain criteria and especially demonstrate the clinical evidence. And for example, in orthopedics, you'd have to show the revision rate of your device. And then so in terms of process, it's also very well regulated. It's 3 times per year by cycle. And you have to log in and submit with the supporting evidence.
Right, but I think it's fair to say that it doesn't, although it's called prosthesis list, it doesn't only cover, and it started out perhaps in orthopedic implants, but now I believe it ranges across coronary stents and cardiovascular devices and a whole range of other products as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. It covers a whole range of devices, and you can really go to on the website, the Australian website, and you have the list that you can download and look at the categories that are available.
Right. Thanks for that. Let's perhaps switch to some of the unique characteristics in one or two other markets, and I want to talk about Japan. And maybe Anand, if you're able to comment on this, Japan has this this concept of foreign reference pricing. How does that work, and what should a startup be aware of before they start pricing their products in Japan? You're on mute, Anand.
Sorry. So I think in Japan, it's more around what is the right comparator, right? And many of the times the companies say we or aspire or try to say that there is no local comparator available. Sometimes if there is a local comparator, then you are compared and you may have lesser flexibility as compared to saying there is no local comparator. And if there is no local comparator, then there are 4 countries that they look at to see what is the price in those countries. That's one. But also if there is nothing available, there is something called cost plus. Whatever is the landed price in Japan, you look at that price, and then having a cost plus approach, that is something that you are able to establish the price in Japan. And that has been the approach that has been their devices, but also pharma. That's something that I've seen before. So and that said, as you know, the healthcare system in Japan has been evolving. They're looking at HTA based decision making, more of a health economics. It's still not fully in place. I think it's getting established for the last, I think, 4 years plus. So one has to understand the dynamics around there, and I think maybe more into those discussions, because it's more for the bigger companies which have bigger portfolios, which immediately will have a price cut which will impact a big few tens of millions of dollars more over there. But I think in that sense, it's more around no comparator locally. You look at what are the other comparators, look at what is the landed cost in Japan, and have a cost plus model. That has been the approach in a very general way in Japan.
Yeah, and another market, of course, that has in recent years implemented price caps for the medical device industry is India. And Anna, maybe you want to comment briefly on that, and what, just in 30 seconds, perhaps update our audience on what's going on with price caps in India.
So in India,
Putting
it's
on the
like,
spot here, sorry about that.
you can go on for like hours on this.
We can have a whole separate webinar on that topic.
So devices in India are not actually devices, right from 2008, this year in February, there was this law which says all the medical devices are actually drugs. So
Yes.
it's because they don't have a separate regulation for devices, and drugs are managed by something called DCA, one of the Drugs and Cosmetics Acts. And there's a different, and also different departments are involved in terms of in this whole gamut of how ultimately the price control happens. So when the devices are drugs, that means they are automatically, and in the past, only some of the devices were designated as drugs. So those were a part of the government price control, which is, so when they are drugs, they become, first of all, they come under the Essential Commodities Act. And that is something which says, these are essential commodities. That means they are automatically coming under something called Drug Price Control Order, DPCO, which is managed by an authority in India called NPPA, National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority. So, and the things become also a little bit more complicated, because what happens is in India, apart from this dynamic, the Ministry of Health has a list called National List of Essential Medicines. So that was supposed to be for the medicines, but they have included in the past, as most of the people will be aware, stents and knee implants came into this NLEM. That means they were automatically a part of this price control. And when they come under NLEM, there are few things that happen, but one of the things is their price automatically gets controlled in terms of an average price of all the different products in that category, which have more than 1% of the market share. So there's some technical pieces that happen, and at the end of the day, you are hit with the price where you are at a high end of that group, and price may be multiple times more. But since many of the devices in that, as you may recall, jumbo groups that used to be there in Germany at one point of time, you are in that category compared with something which is very low, so your price gets cut. But again, as I said, these are things for when you are having bigger business, when you are looking at how the price can impact. impact you when you have established business. At this stage, go in with the free mind, look at the right segment that can afford you and have out-of-pocket payment for you. And India, there's multiple other things happening as we speak. There is multiple things. So I think I'll stop over here.
Yeah, no, we
I've
can
more
go
than
on and
30
on about
seconds.
India. Well, thanks for that, Anand. Anand, I'll turn to you on China very briefly. I know that you've been intimately involved in some of the tender policies there and volume-based procurement and so on. Maybe very briefly, you can tell us a bit about that and what the impact might be for a smaller company trying to get into China.
Right. Obviously, China is a really extremely big market and a focus of many companies to be able to win in China. So I'd call open a little bit what Fabio said about looking whether there is already an existing pathway for you to get reimbursement or billing codes into the China market, which would be, let's say, after regulatory approval, the easiest pathway. But the biggest market access challenge would be around winning tenders. And if you look at the market access for China, it's very complex because it's not like in Australia or Japan where you have a national decision-making level. In China, what you have to understand is an extremely complex and fragmented market. There are decision levels at national level, regional and province level, and then sometimes at city levels. For big cities such as Beijing or Shanghai. And then you also have the last step, let's say, which is the hospital listing and hospital access. In the last few years, we've seen that the China government has put on a mandate to reduce the healthcare expenditure and increase coverage for their patients. So which means that they are going at cutting as much prices as possible. And what is interesting to see is that because of that fragmentation and complexity, we have observed that they have put in place different pilots of price cutting policies and measures to see which ones would work best. So we really see some of these policies being implemented at the same time and in different provinces. So you have, for example, the sunshine procurement or centralized tendering procurement to really enable hospital to have a better negotiation power with higher volume, but also disclosing some of these prices being negotiated for transparency, but also better negotiation. And recently, what we have seen is national tender being piloted, especially for stents, for example, where we are not negotiating at provincial levels, but really at the national level. So the price would be nationwide applied. And then also the second one in terms of measure is around volume-based procurement. And it is really a purchase of volume commission. And then the negotiation is going to be how much of price cut are you willing to forego. And what is really important for tenders is that it's the winner takes all. And so they would select a few companies that will have the contract that these tenders for the next 2 or 3 years. And all the others would have to leave that province and lose completely business in these provinces. So not just these volume-based procurement, but also there are other pilots such as HTA or DRG being implemented to really curb again the price and cuts. So just to go back to that national tender and volume-based procurement, is that the price cut is really significant. It could be from 20 to 60% of the price cut.
Very, very concerning, obviously, if you are if you do business in China. But thanks for that. I wanted to move along and maybe talk about a few higher level and broader concepts here, and I'll turn to Fabio for this one. And I don't think we need to go into the details, perhaps, of universal health coverage, and there's a lot of information out there on that. But value-based healthcare is a concept that's coming up more frequently now in Asia Pacific. Maybe tell us very briefly what is it, and what are the trends in value-based healthcare here in the region, and what would be maybe the implications for industry.
So I think let's start maybe from basics. Value-based healthcare is essentially the ability for I guess healthcare system to judge the value that specific new therapy, new device will bring to the patient, and therefore reward those appropriately. So to give you an example, that has been more I guess applied at this point to pharma rather than medical devices, because there is a more direct correlation between, or a perceived more direct correlation between the use of the drug and the improvement in patients. And so a lot of drugs have been, some drugs have reached value-based agreements, especially, for example, in Australia, where they have been paid depending on the results the patients have achieved. And so if a drug does not achieve results in a stated percentage of patients, which typically is taken by either from the clinical trial or from real world evidence, then it won't get as much reimbursement. So that's a general concept. I would say that has been more a discussion from the industry side rather than an actual application of it. We've seen examples in, as I said, in Australia. I don't recall any in Japan. I think there is examples, really limited examples across Asia Pacific of value-based healthcare, and that's primarily because I think most of the system are still grappling with what Anne and Anand were saying before, which is essentially they don't have enough money to cover basic needs, let alone start to think about advanced therapies and value-based healthcare. That being said, is it a trend for the region? Yes, it is. Is it going to take a hold soon? My personal view is that it won't. It will be a slow trickle. It will be for very specific therapies and for very specific devices. But it won't be a overall of the system as we know it. And happy to hear other views on this, but that would be my take.
Thanks, Fabio. That's helpful. Do we have any different views on value-based healthcare and its outlook for Asia Pacific? Do you broadly agree with Fabio on this?
I would broadly agree, but I think this has been used and abused, one might say, for price cuts. This is not the right, value-based healthcare means we'll cut the prices. So typically, as Fabio was mentioning, the value-based is something which is more like risk sharing. You say, in the trials, that's evidence, and we believe you pay us this price because that's what will happen. And the payer doesn't know, and the company hasn't demonstrated it. So we instead of fighting with each other or negotiating while the patient is waiting, let's see how it happens, and then we see what value we have been able to establish. But it has been many of the times used that value-based healthcare, and sometimes even within the companies, when we see this has been used, a very nice term for things that many of the people even don't understand what is value-based healthcare, even within the companies. So we have to be very clear in terms of the understanding of this piece and really talk about what value you are bringing and establish that and understand And we had in the past, I think with some of the cohorts, we had the discussion with them, what value you're talking about, for whom, and what do they consider. So there are multiple elements to it. It's just, I would say, even more in Asia, it's more like a fashionable term as yet. It's still too early, unlike what you see very rarely in Spain and Italy, for example, value-based healthcare examples, but too early for Asia.
Yeah. So thanks for that. The other concept, of course, here that I think may be more immediate, more relevant to startups here are health technology assessments. There are already HTA agencies around the region, and maybe I'll stay with Anand for this, for your perspective on this. What is HTA, and how would you characterize the evolving HTA landscape in Asia Pacific in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, is small to say, but then
we start with the definition. Just what is it? What is HTA?
So health
for those
technology
in our audience.
So health technology assessment. It's, and Anne is more of an expert, and she's kind of done in this here. So I'll defer to Anne after this. But it's like, what benefits your technology brings in, and every country, or some of the countries that have defined threshold. What is the cost effectiveness ratio, as it is called, incremental cost effectiveness ratio, whatever benefits you say you are bringing versus whatever incremental costs you are saying is going to come. And many of the times is based upon a multiplier of the GDP per capita of that country. So it can range from 1 to 3 or sometimes more. In UK, it is defined as 30,000 pounds. In Australia, it's not clearly defined, but there is a range which is higher for some of the rare diseases or high cost treatments. But end of the day, what the governments are saying, our cost is going up. I need to have an understanding of what we are paying for. So these agencies help us, and there are specific tools, methodologies, single technology assessment, multiple technology assessment, and then they come up to say, this particular treatment is cost effective or not. Sometimes when they say yes or no, or other times they invite the companies to say, okay, let's have a price negotiation. If you get the price down, maybe you are able to have your cost effectiveness threshold that we consider being met. In the past, in many of the countries, it was kind of visible, but now led by UK, but we also see in Australia and other countries where you can have confidential negotiation where the price is not disclosed, but you are able to give a discount to the payer. So that's in a nutshell, but
so what role does HTA play in obtaining reimbursement?
So in many of the times, you have to pass through in the process of reimbursement itself. Clearly you have to go through the regulatory piece. Once that is done, you need to go through step by step in terms of passing through the HTA body, which could be a HERA in Korea, or which could be PBAC in Australia. Once you go through that, after that, and there are bodies, whether it is the PBS in listing in Australia, or NHIA in Korea, they say, okay, tick mark, you have passed our HERA threshold. Now let's come and talk. And then the discussion happens about budget impact, whether we are able to pay for it, and maybe another price cut may happen. But it is a part of this overall pathway that if you want to get the national reimbursement, you need to go through this process. And also in Thailand, you have to go through the process of getting the health economic approval done before you get the national reimbursement. So it's very much a linear path, I would say.
Yeah, thanks. And Anne, what is the type of evidence and data typically that HTA agencies are looking for?
Right. I think that the terminology of HTA, of health technology assessment, actually is a little bit like value-based healthcare, because there are different considerations and different meanings depending on the market that you're considering in the healthcare system. Sometimes what really matters maybe to our audience here is what is the evaluation process to get reimbursement. I would rephrase it to that way, because actually HTA is just one of the methodology to evaluate systematically a new technology for a payer in order to provide that reimbursement or not. And if you think about the real HTA is typically you would cite NICE in the UK. That is what is really called HTA. It's very stringent in terms of the evidence that has to go into it. It includes systematic literature review on how your technology is comparing in the current clinical practice. It includes your clinical evidence, and typically you would require a comparator to the standard of care in that market. And in addition to the clinical evidence, and most of the time comparative evidence that is required, you also need to develop a health economics model to demonstrate the cost effectiveness of your technology. So it is, in the pure term of it, and then this consideration of qualities in ICER, that threshold that Anand is referring to is extremely complex, requiring a lot of resources and investment into generating the evidence to support it. If you look at Asia Pacific, there are some markets that has really strong HTA, similar to the NICE in the UK. For example, I'd say Thailand is one of the toughest in terms of HTA evaluation. But in other markets, like Japan, it is called a HTA market because they actually have a clear evaluation process that requires evidence. But right now, it's more of a clinical evidence, and you do have to put in the economic impact, but you don't always have to produce a health economic model and analysis in your dossier. Really, what in terms of evidence that you need to really think in priority and critically is what is the value you're bringing to the market that addresses that unmet need, and therefore what is the proof that you need to provide.
Right.
And the first thing would be first clinical evidence.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne. That's very, very helpful. Now let's move on to the topic of reimbursement of digital health. And I think this is of interest to many of our cohort participants, because many of them I know we have at least one company in the area of digital therapeutics. We have many companies that have AI algorithms and various digital health elements in their offering. And I know, Fabio, that at LEK, you did published a recent paper, which we will share with our cohort after this webinar, on digital health reimbursement. Maybe do you want to provide us a quick summary of that and some of the key findings that you obtained from that survey, and what the implications might be for the smaller companies here?
Yeah. So first of all, I should say that the article was actually done in collaboration with APAC Med and the reimbursement the digital reimbursement committee, which Anne is part of. And what we looked at, and she had actually a fair amount of input on that. So what we looked at was really the best practices that we found in the region for digital reimbursement. As we said before, there isn't too much in terms of a clear pathway for regulatory approval, let alone the sort of reimbursement side. So what we looked at was really clearly, number one, markets that are reimbursed for obvious reasons, because this is about reimbursement, and second is about what companies had done in order to get reimbursed. And what we did was we sort of distilled a few best practices that we've seen companies regularly adopt. Now, I should also say if from memory, none of these were, and I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but none of these were pure digital solutions. Most times they were digital solutions that were together with an existing device. And so the sort of pure digital solution reimbursement we haven't seen yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that comes along relatively quickly. So typically, some things we already mentioned, right? So around developing a good understanding of what the reimbursement guidelines are, but also we do think that there is a need for generating evidence in digital solutions, and this needs to be done in market with KOLs, making sure that you essentially bring on your side people that can help with that reimbursement discussions. You do need to invest in market creation, which is what we were saying before around if you have to launch in the private market, make sure that you gain acceptance and you gain clinician support, and then after that you can go for reimbursement. And also it's investment in generation of evidence, which is not trivial in terms of expense. And then essentially the other key point I would say that is different than the normal medical devices is really around looking for alternative funding streams. So it may not be that your digital solution gets refunded from the typical medical device budget. It may be that actually you have to look for a slightly different way of getting that refunded, which may be through the healthcare budget, which may be through the hospital budget, for example, if there is an angle around improving hospital operations. So those are just examples of things that are different from the typical medical device path. But I would say, number one, there is no defined digital path for reimbursement in any of these markets. And number two, it does need to be creative in terms of a solution to get to reimbursement.
Yeah.
And the article will explain that much better than than I probably have in this minute.
No, that's okay. But I was going to actually ask you a follow-up question because I know you looked at monetization models as well. And do you want to comment perhaps briefly on some of your key findings on digital health monetization models?
So again, I think that some of those are fairly known, meaning the typical monetization model would be a pay-per-use, sort of an upfront maintenance plus rental fees, device plus consumables, and upfront plus subscription fees, which are, again, if you look at the categories, they're fairly common. They're fairly common for razor blades, and they're common for medical devices and IVD, for example. So I don't think there is anything specifically new within the models. I think that the key point, though, is as you think about your business model, which goes back to what Anand was saying at the beginning, as you think about your device launch, the first thing you need to think about is what is your commercial model, and therefore how are you going to get paid? Is it you sell the device? Is it you rent the device? Is it you rent the device and you get paid for consumables? Whatever the case is, but you launch the device for free, and then you get paid for consumables. All of those things need to be resolved pretty much at the planning stage, because if you don't do that, if you don't know how your technology is going to get paid, then there is no reimbursement or private pay that can help you.
Yeah, great points there, Fabio. Thanks for that. And I know you were involved in that study as well. Anything that you want to add to that in terms of the findings of that study, and any advice to the startup community here?
Yeah, so it was really a great work that Fabio and his team has completed with this, because as a chair of the digital health committee from APAC Med, the first thing that we wanted to understand is what is the current landscape for access for these digital technologies. And we know that it is very difficult actually to look at these technologies. We know that policymakers and payers are still struggling to categorize them in the right way. And then how do you evaluate that before you think about actually funding? really, we really could see that there was a struggle, very much like there was a struggle between differentiation of medical devices versus drugs. You can't use the same methodology or the same way of evaluating these digital technologies. How would you evaluate an artificial intelligence technology that would help you in the surgeon and the physician or the hospital in providing better care, more efficient care to the patient compared to your typical stent that you can really show after the implant, you can see the improvement in the patient outcomes. And then also we have a lot of digital health that are softwares that are constantly being updated. Like our phones have updates so many times every few months. So when you think about evaluation and then the supporting evidence that you need to generate again, which version are you referring to? Once you start a clinical trial, you have to keep it within the same product or version. But then we know that clinical trials would take 2 or 3 years. So by that time, you would have already been in version 10 when you started with version 1. So how are we going to be able to evaluate that and put the right price and therefore funding around it? So that's what we really see as the big gap in that report, that the currently digital health solutions have to comply within the existing evaluation and reimbursement frameworks. However, we should not take it as it is.
Yeah.
But there are also some companies that have been quite innovative in their approach in building new business models, partnering with other stakeholders such as medical societies to build that expertise and evidence, as well as private insurers that are willing to take that risk into providing that coverage. And we hope that it would just be the starting point to help more established payers and national payers to consider the funding. Yeah.
That's great feedback. I have to interrupt you here, I'm afraid. And we could go on for a long time. Great discussion. We have reached the end of the hour. I wanted to thank our panelists and maybe just ask for very quickly a last parting word. If there's any final words of advice that you might have for our startups. And Anand, I'll start with you.
No, I think I go back to the beginning, look at more your commercial model, what should be the right price, what is the segmentation. Reimbursement will come later. And reimbursement is, again, in a general way, look at who are the payers, the self-payers. I would always go to the private insurance first before go to the national payers, because there you have easier communication. You can have some experiments and pilots and understand how the way the health system works, so that you can plug in where your technology or your new treatment comes in.
Great, thanks. Fabio, I know you've spoken about commercial models as well.
Yeah, so I think, look, I don't have actually much to add to Anand. I completely agree. Look at the commercial model. As you improve your technology, as you work on your tech, your engineering, do not forget your commercial model, because you'll end up with a mismatch at some point.
Yeah, thanks. Anne, last parting words?
I'd say that for me, probably it would go with what is the problem that your innovation is trying to solve. And if you can get that really clearly defined, then the value of your innovation would become really clear cut, and that negotiation and a demonstration of the value of your innovation would, I think, become clear on what you need to do in terms of the evidence to support that claim, as well as the negotiation that you'd have with the different stakeholders to get the funding of your innovation. And thinking that would be really the starting point of that strategy, because then otherwise the process would be quite straightforward once you really define that value.
Yeah, great point. So on that note, thank you all so much. Our apologies for going slightly over time. Thank you to our audience on YouTube. For our panelists, stay on. We'll move on to Q&A in just a minute. For those of you who've been following us on YouTube, thank you so much. We'll be back next week no, we won't. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time on a new topic. So thank you all on YouTube, and for the rest, please stay on the line.